So on September 11th, 2001, our Western understanding of terrorism forever changed. Now, what terrorism represented at a fundamental level stayed exactly as it always had, a social and evolutionary process from our bloodied and battered past. It was a manner that we, as Westerners, perceived terrorism that was drastically altered forever. The images of commercial airliners traveling at speeds exceeding 450 miles per hour, bursting into flames, were etched into the minds of millions of individuals worldwide, reaching all four corners of the globe. We were collectively victimized as these images of death, destruction, and fear unraveled, whether or not we watched this from ground zero or from within the comfort of our own homes. The power of communication and technology had essentially removed the distal properties normally attributed to an act of terrorism and brought it to our doorsteps. All of a sudden, the probability of being victimized as a Westerner by an act of terror no longer seems so much a question of if, but more a matter of when. Within a matter of seconds after the events commenced, nearly a quarter of the world's population was instantaneously considered with anxious speculation, mistrust, and prejudice. This was unjustly done, perhaps. It was certainly unfair, but also, unfortunately, undeniable. Now, basic criminological and social psychological theories linked to the process of otherness, labeling, stereotypes, come to mind when discussing what occurred in the moments after 9/11. Now, stereotypes and labels provide us with what's called a cognitive heuristic. That is a mental shortcut, if you will, that provides us with some information to assist in impression formation. Essentially, it gives you a quick bit of memory recall that will allow you to deal with particular individuals in particular situations. Unfortunately, this usually occurs with miserable consequences. Following the acts on that fateful day, we again saw a proliferation of increased acts of extremism, of terrorism, of insurgency across the world. Now, it is this basic premise of otherness that I want to discuss with you today. I essentially want to use basic social psychological principles in understanding why this occurred, what's going on now, and how we may be able to ameliorate global relations. So here goes. I want everyone for a moment to think exactly what defines a terrorist act. Now, I can promise you that most global experts fail to reach a pure consensus on exactly how we define this. We can probably agree that there are certain elements of ideological belief, whether that be philosophical, religious, or political. These ideological beliefs usually exist on a spectrum, and from a Western perspective, we tend to place this on the extremes of these spectrums. So right there, we have two elements: these ideologies, and the idea that these ideologies come into conflict with many things that we believe, many of our own morals, many of our own values. That is, in essence, the creation of another, all right? The otherness effect. Thirdly, we have the utility or the use of fear. Fear is a powerful tool. Fear can assist any organization, whether we label them as terrorists or whether we label ourselves as peacekeepers, in essence to garner and make advancements in the procurement of what they hope to achieve. Again, this installation of fear in a vulnerable population is extremely powerful. Fear of what, many of us ask? Fear of the unknown, fear of the unexpected, fear of death, fear of leaving our homes or carrying them about with our normal routines. I want everyone to think, just for 1 second, what it felt like the first time you flew in an airplane following 9/11, or taking the tube after the attacks in London on 7/7. There was that unsettling, deep-rooted, entrenched sensation of uncertainty, of anxiety, of panic, of fear. Again, as I mentioned earlier, this is nothing new. It's been around since the dawn of time, utilized throughout the rise and falls of empires. Much of the 20th century was marred by anti-colonial upheavals, in which many of the individuals involved with these armed conflicts were often labeled as terrorists by imperialist powers. So throughout our history, we've seen very different circumstances, very different situations in which we've labeled others, in which others have used fear and violence, in which we've used it back, but again, all for very similar purposes. Now let's use a very familial anecdote. I'm sure everyone has heard of the boogeyman at one point or another in their lives. The boogeyman embodies everything that we fear, maybe not now as adults, but as children. Now, if I am an authoritative figure and I want my child to be obedient, to conform to my expectations, to garner some form of benefit from their behavior, I'm going to threaten them with the negative consequences of disobeying and perhaps a visit from the boogeyman in their sleep. Not very nice, but again, the power of fear. We can probably draw another parallel with Father Christmas. Perhaps not the same as being visited in the middle of the night, but if I do not behave and I do not meet the conformative values of my parents expect of me, then, well, the threat is I will be on the naughty list for the year, and I will not be rewarded come Christmas morning. Now, loose examples, I appreciate that, and by no means am I trying to belittle religious, political, or philosophical beliefs. I'm just trying to provide a little bit of contextualization, all right? An appreciation that fear, others are very powerful tools in the discourse of what we have called, over the last 14-odd years, the global war on terror. If we take a quick tally of many of the armed conflicts that are registering on our proverbial radar at the moment, we come up with these elements of definitional confusion. So let's go through a few. We have Ukrainian and pro-Russian separatists fighting to a stalemate in Eastern Europe with a downed passenger airline as part of the saga. Recently, Israeli and Arab relations have been tense with Iron Dome in full utilization. Kenya is clamping down on all so-called militant activity by al-Shabaab. Syria is in the midst of a very lengthy, bloody civil war in which we do not know who is going to come out victorious, nor do we know if we want anybody to come out victorious. Iraq is seemingly on the verge of collapse for the third time in nearly 20 years. And out of the ashes of these latter two conflicts, we have the proliferation of ISIS, or ISIL, the Islamic State, who are proving a much more difficult threat to neutralize than we previously thought. What's important about knowing all of these conflicts and knowing the difference? Well, the importance is definition. The importance is how they utilize fear against each other, and the importance is this idea of the other. An interesting social and humanistic perspective can be taken when teasing apart the linguistic properties in these conflicts involving who we call the aggressors, the victims, the liberators, the freedom fighters, the terrorists, the good guys, and of course, the bad. Now, if I were to say that it's all a matter of perspective, many of you would immediately disagree with me based off of your socioeconomic, religious, or political background. Furthermore, I believe it's safe to assume that several people listening at the moment completely disagree and think, well, hold on, wait just 1 minute. It's much more complex than this idea of others, fear, and different values. So I'll stop you right there, and I will agree with you. Yes, it is much more complex. But the proviso of this talk is that I am not a theologian, I am not a philosopher, and I am not here lobbying for your votes for the next general election. I'm a psychologist, and it's from that perspective that we are taking this today. So, to recap where we are thus far, we've got fear of the other, incongruent ideals, values, ideologies coming into conflict. Well, where's the social psychology, the actual gritty theory behind all of this? That's where we bring in intergroup contact. Now, intergroup contact is a set of theories linked to how different groups of people in society come into interaction, interface, and experience with each other. So obviously, within any social sphere, different groups are defined by different characteristics. You can be defined by your religion, by your politics, color of your skin, your sexual orientation. It doesn't matter. Intergroup contact essentially postulates that the more we have in common with members of our own group and other groups will facilitate how well we get along. The more differentiation we have or incongruency we have between groups, then the less likely we'll get along. It's quite simple basic psychology. Now, there are optimal conditions, such as the intent to cooperate, ideals of equal status, whether or not cooperating with members of another group is seen as a normative value within the society that one finds themselves. So when we take these ideas of intergroup contact and bring them down to understanding terrorism and the other and the use of fear, well, obviously we have very different groups that are perceiving the same conflict in extremely different ways. We're not going to see each other accordingly, are we here? What's that going to lead to? Well, we've seen it. Death, destruction, insurgency, bombs. Often with intervening military forces in countries like Afghanistan and Iraq, and when I say intervening military forces, I mean British, American, French, all right? We see an incongruent set of values by the so-called peacekeepers with the locals, with the local inhabitants. All of a sudden, the local occupied citizen has been labeled an insurgent, has been labeled an extremist, has been labeled a terrorist by their intervening power. This is problematic. So what am I going to do when I am a Western military force in another country where I know very little about it, and I am essentially trying to help them? I'm essentially trying to instill democracy. I'm essentially trying to control order and serve and protect the people. This is where we bring in the concept of procedural justice. Procedural justice, in a very basic sense, is a policing term, actually. And it's a policing term that's used to explain police-public relations. Essentially, what procedural justice postulates in countries like Britain, Canada, America, is that the police, in order to do their jobs, require the consent of the public. If they have the consent of the public, then they are able to cooperate, collaborate, and deal with the prevention of crime. They are able to serve and protect. Thus, they instill trust, they instill confidence in the public are more likely to engage with them in ongoing police investigations, and they are seen as a legitimate social institution. Much more simply, make me trust you, I'll give you some confidence, and I'll help you out in the future if you need help. However, when this procedural justice model of policing fails, mayhem ensues. The summer riots of 2011 are a very good example, to an extent, of where procedural justice failed. The recent disorder in Ferguson, Missouri, with the seemingly racially provoked killings of not one but two young Afro-Caribbean men, are other similar examples. Over the 1990s, we saw Western militaries fail in Africa twice, once in Somalia, once in Rwanda, again losing their legitimacy of the public and people they were trying to assist. So why does this matter? It's one thing to talk about procedural justice, different groups, using fear, preventing radicalization on the streets of Britain, New York, Paris. It's another thing when I'm trying to instill law and order on the streets of Kabul or Baghdad at the moment. Again, not only do we have a quote-unquote occupied people at this time, we also have Western intervention that, to many scholars and many people out there, think has lasted for far too long. So I myself engaged in some research, both locally, nationally, and internationally, including two of the volatile armed conflict zones we're talking about today. I spoke with police in Britain, I spoke with military, both American and British, across some of these zones, and I spoke with young Muslim men and women, both here at home and abroad. And the consensus and findings were quite interesting. Simply put, those young Muslim men and women, regardless if you're in Britain or in Afghanistan, who thought that the police or the military powers were doing a good job, were understanding, were treating them justly, were being fair in the installation of power and the installation of authority, were more likely to cooperate, were more likely to engage, and were more optimistic about future relations in combating the global war on terror. Those that had experienced several negative encounters, again, both at home and abroad, were much more cynical and bullheaded about any form of amelioration. What was interesting with the latter group, the ones that had negative experiences, was that it didn't need to be directly. It could be through a significant other, a brother, a mother, a sister, a wife, a husband. That's quite a powerful tool right there. Basic public relations. We need to make a good impression. Two key things emerged from discussions with these young people and the police and the military. Politeness and moral regulation were of the utmost importance in building strong ties abroad, especially when using foreign military forces. Often when British, American, Canadian troops go into other countries, they do not speak the local dialect or language in which they are intervening within. Vice versa, the local inhabitants likely have very limited use of English. Explicitives, swear words on behalf of our foreign intervening forces are quite commonplace. And regardless of your English language abilities, these are universally recognized as derogatory, hostile, and aggressive. It's not going to help with reducing radicalization. It's not going to help with forging diplomatic ties. It's not going to assist with cooperative and collaborative practices. On the contrary, it's going to lead to hostility, radicalization, extremism, and anger. Remember, we've been in some of these places for over 14 years. We've outworn our welcome. So we have to remember that at the end of the day, although we're fortunate enough to come from a democratic society, and we may take for granted what that embodies, many other cultures and societies are not. It is not our holy duty to dictate our hegemony onto the societies of others. They must learn and adapt, evolve and understand within their own right, just as we ourselves have done and continue to do within our own multicultural societies. One of the reasons why ISIS is so popular at the moment is because they are building their success upon our failures in Iraq over the last 14 years. They are providing a common ground, inclusion and social integration based off wrongdoings and grievances that we are partially responsible for. Instead of going into foreign nations with excited trigger fingers, imperialist attitudes, and negative stereotypes towards these other people, we need to have a better appreciation for the other. We need to have a better understanding of geopolitics and a better comprehension of civilizations that are much older than our own and that have not ever dealt with democracy. I can't walk in to a country that has never seen democracy and go, there you go, 2 years, here you go. I hope you enjoy what you're going to do with democracy. It's not going to work. Instead, facilitating good relationships, having cultural values, respecting norms, morals, views of others can go a long way in the reduction of radicalization and in creating strong partnerships in times of humanitarian need and crisis. Fighting the war on terror can begin right now in our homes, on our streets, in our neighborhoods, in our cities, locally and abroad, with better cultural understanding, more informed opinions about what other morals and values mean, but also with brief interaction, understanding, and appreciation for who the other is. Thank you.